equality of women, laws protecting women's rights could still be amended or even repealed. And the Supreme Court Justice, were you going to share the Scalia quote? Yeah, they said, certainly the Constitution does not require discrimination on the basis of sex. The only issue is whether it prohibits it. It doesn't. So I'm going to see, does anyone here know who Lilly Ledbetter is? Okay, good. So some of you know. And if I get anything wrong, can you just privately disagree, or in your head? Is that how it works, John? You're like, keep it quiet if you disagree with me. No, I'm going to try to give you a little bit of relevancy, because she worked for Goodyear for 19 years, had a high position. She was a manager, one of the few women working. And 19 years into her career, she gets a secret letter in her office showing her that she's getting paid less than some of her employees and her male peers. So she sues, wins her case, gets a couple $1 million, and then it goes to appeals courts, all the way to Supreme Court level, and she lost her case. So in 2008, Congress starts scrambling, because this shows that the Civil Rights Act is not enough, or the 14th Amendment was not enough. And then they created the Lilly Ledbetter Act. And all this is doing, though, is extending the period. Because why she lost is because she didn't sue within the right amount of weeks from the time the pay stub showed the pay discrepancy. So that's why these little acts, and so that now we have the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which gives you 6 months now to sue if you realize you're getting paid less. And so the Equal Rights Amendment will help make this a higher level of scrutiny in the court cases. So there's 2 bills that are in right now, which she's going to go over. One of them lists the deadline, or the other one reintroduces the Equal Rights Amendment. And so we're going to let Chelsea talk about how the E.R.A. can get passed today, and that's why there is hope.
Okay, so one of the things Anissa was saying that I just want to highlight, again, is with an E.R.A., you can have a constitutional amendment that's very difficult to repeal, okay? What's happening to women's rights, if you've looked at the last 10 years, is we have certain rights that we've fought for and achieved that then are being taken away. We've seen that, right? The war on women, the marches. We've seen that if you fight these individual laws, not only does it take manpower, excuse me?
Hobby Lobby.
Hobby Lobby, contraceptive. If you fight each individual gender discrimination case one by one, think of the money, resources, time, and energy that goes into that one thing that might only extend something 6 months. And that if you vote in the wrong guy, it could be gone the next year. So that's why the Equal Rights Amendment was initially thought of. So let me go all the way back to when it was written. 1920, women get the right to vote. 1923, Alice Paul realizes, hey, we fought so hard for this right to vote, and yet there are laws on the books that say I can't own land. I can't get divorced. I can't live in an apartment by myself. I can't even apply to jobs that don't say for women. She realized it doesn't matter if women have the right to vote if there's structural violence in place in our Constitution and in our law that makes it so women aren't protected and guaranteed. And that's what Alice Paul wanted. She says the protection and guarantees of the law, okay? Just the same as everyone else. So she wrote it in 1923, and the history of that is, for years and years and years, it didn't pass because people were doing child labor union laws. The unions thought, oh no, if we pass the Equal Rights Amendment, it might affect our power as unions. Okay, then it switched. And we began to see not Democrats, but Republicans fighting against the E.R.A. then. Why? Women's rights movements, civil rights. People began to see, oh no, now the women want to take over, right? So there was a huge pushback from the Republicans on moral issues. The church's stance at the time, there's a 27-page document, which we have some legal scholars that are going to go through one by one and talk about how those have been invalidated in the last 40 years. But 2 of the main arguments were, 1, we don't need it, because we have the 14th Amendment and women are protected. And 2, ironically, it will change the face of the earth if we have it. This was the argument. And what we've discovered in the last 40 years, we luckily have this hindsight. What we've discovered is all of those fears that were once terrifying to people, we've seen them come and go. We've seen gay marriage, we've seen equal pay, equal employment acts, we've seen male-female / bathrooms. We've seen the draft go away. We've seen these fears, these 27 fears the church had, that if the E.R.A. passed, women would be forced out of the home. We've seen these things happen, so we have the ability to say, actually, that wouldn't happen. We have proof. And quite frankly, we've also seen the opposite. Justice Scalia denied class action lawsuit on gender discrimination because he said, women are not protected in the Constitution. If you don't like it, go change it. Okay? And so we've seen all of these things, all these early arguments being changed, and so that's the benefit of time. The consequence of times is no one cares. No one our age cares. No one cares. They think we are already equal. What's great about Mormons is that because we're in a patriarchal structure, we're able to be aware of gender discrimination in a way that some of our secular colleagues aren't. Do you agree? I'm seeing laughter. Right? Let's look at the positive. Woo! To patriarchy! So, there is this irony when I try to recruit non-Mormons to fight for the E.R.A. They're like, I don't get it. What's wrong? And my Mormon sisters are, oh yeah. Okay? So there's a cultural consciousness and awareness that we have of perception and equality that allows us to see things that maybe our non-member sisters can't. And let me explain why we need Mormons for E.R.A. and then we'll tell you some specific things that we're doing. With the state strategies, so there's actually like 3 now, okay? So one of them is to say the time limit was unconstitutional. So same Alice Paul watched the Democrats fight the E.R.A., she watched the Republicans fight the E.R.A., and nearing her deathbed, she watched them pass it. And everyone went to her house and said, yay, are you so excited? We finally passed the E.R.A. after 40 years. And she cried, and they thought she was crying out of joy. She said, no, they just killed us. No one understood why she was so upset. She said, with a 7-year time limit, you cannot get an amendment this controversial passed. And she was absolutely right. Amendments take time. And in the history of amendment, and legal scholars will say, amendments rarely pass during their their time period of contestation. And we saw that with the 14th Amendment, and we're seeing this with the E.R.A. And this should get you all excited, that I'm basically asking you to, I need my hands, I can't talk without hands. We're basically asking you to join an organization where we've already weighted the scales. The scales are already weighted in your favor. Amendments don't pass during the time of contestation. It's 40 years later, that's usually from a historical time period when amendments pass, so we've already weighted the scale. Most people in this country think we already have it. Weighted the scale. So you are doing something in an activist effort that people would kill for from a strategy point of view. You're trying to pass something that people already think we have and no one cares about anymore. Okay, that's doable, okay? The only problem with that strategy is anytime it goes up to Congress, we have Congresswoman Maloney always pushing it forward, and we have Representative Maloney and Senator Jim from Menendez. Every year they put that bill down, and guess what? There's always something more important than women. And I want you to think about the history of the right to vote. I want you to think about the history of equal employment, and I want you to think about equal pay. There is always something more important than women. And it takes some audacity to say, no, we're important, we should vote. And so that's the only problem holding back the E.R.A. now, is people who care enough to call their senators, call their congresspeople, and say, hey, I care about this issue, co-sponsor it, get on the bill, bring it to the table. Now, if they bring it to the table, and just P.S., what I always tell my E.R.A. National Task Force people is Mormons are really good at calling trees. We're so good. And they love us because guess what? I've proven that when they do a rally, to get my secular, non-Mormon friends to show up, to take a day off work, or to show up on a Saturday or Sunday, heaven forbid, we might get 10. And when I showed them with ordained women, we got 500. 500. They were flabbergasted. And so part of the reason we're doing this with the weighted scale and the Mormons is, no offense, but you guys are really good at volunteering, okay? We need bodies and we need people to call, and y'all are great at it. And they love us for it because guess what? We can't get our friends to do this. So we need to do this, okay? So if this gets passed, if we finally get these bills on the table to be voted on, there's a couple things we have to vote on. Can we say that the Constitution time limit was unconstitutional? There's some legal precedent for that. We've had amendments passed that took 100 years. They were allowed 100 years to pass. And let me tell you, if we had 100 years to pass the E.R.A., we would have had that, okay? So we want to argue the Constitution the time limit was invalid. If that comes to pass and we get permission for that and it gets voted on, guess what? We only need 3 states. And I want you to think strategically of the map. Let me tell you the states that are unratified. The South, and Utah, Nevada, and Arizona. So in a 3-state strategy, I'm getting chills. In a 3-state strategy, Mormons have the most power to pass an amendment of any other voting bloc. Think of the ripples of a log falling down. Mormons have the power to change this bill, okay? Now, if that doesn't pass and we have to do the new E.R.A, we need all 38. So we're still gonna have to fight all of those, but most of them will pass quite quickly just like they did last time. So our strategy is pretty much the same. We're still gonna have some holdovers in Mormon County. And so this is how we approach it from Mormons for E.R.A, and we'll get into some more details, is we know our people, we love our people, we wanna make amends for what happened last time, we think this is good, and we wanna work with the church. We want to say, okay, we learned you don't like changes in doctrine for women. But what about changes that don't deal with doctrine? If you really believe women are equal, and they've said multiple times that should have the same equality, should have the same equal protections and rights, the church has said multiple times, then fight for us. Give us measurable equality and protections in the Constitution. It doesn't have to change the doctrine. Now, who knows if that will work? Come on. But regardless, look at the 3 states we need. Look who makes up the biggest body. And if what we can do to that huge rock that creates the biggest ripples is turn it into little rocks where people have a diversity of opinion, we've already won half the battle. Okay? And so our goal is to educate, because guess what? That story of, hey, I'm giving you a calling, you have no idea what it's called, we're not gonna call it E.R.A, and you're gonna go vote for us, happened over and over and over again. And we are not gonna let it happen to another generation. So let's say there is opposition, which I hope there's not. I hope we can just be buddies and help women. But if there's opposition with the church, how much harder will it be for them to mass vote if we've already educated? Okay? And so we need those 2 efforts as we move forward, and we need you. I mean, even if it's just the calling and the pestering, this needs to happen, and you are the most likely body to do it, and we've already weighted the scale. Okay? No complaints? You're all on board? Okay.
Okay, we don't have a lot of time, so I narrowed it down to just 5 reasons that we need the E.R.A, but there are a lot more than this. Reason number 1, it's just time to write women into the Constitution. With the exception of the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage, women are not in the Constitution. And I'll explain a little bit later why the word person in the 14th Amendment or other places in the Constitution really does not include women like oftentimes we might think it is. Research. So medical research is governed by lots of laws, regulations, and things like that. And you'd think, okay, well, I'm sure those good doctors and people that do research take women into account when they do that. Well, the truth is, historically, they haven't. The male has been the default. We just come up with some medicine, we test it on men, it seems to work, and then we assume that if we just like reduce the dosage for size or something like that, it'll work on women. Well, that's totally inaccurate, and science is finding out more and more that that can be terrible. For example, just one example, we all know symptoms of a heart attack or pain like in your left shoulder and chest pain and things like that. Well, that's true for men, but for women, oftentimes it's like lower gut pain. And a lot of doctors don't even seem to know that. So a lot of times women end up dying or suffering a lot more damage because even doctors don't have the research that tells them how women react to things. Medication, all kinds of different problems in that area. Family law, there's benefits for men from the Equal Rights Amendment. I was a single dad for a lot of years. And I was lucky because it was kind of a negotiated deal, but the default has tended to be that the mother takes custody and the father, goes and does whatever. Well, that's not really great for the kids, because simply using sex stereotypes as a way to decide who gets the kids doesn't really give the kids to the person they ought to be with. The Commerce Clause is not enough. How many here know that when we're talking about private discrimination law, we're talking about the Commerce Clause in the Constitution? Okay, just a handful. All right. So if your boss fires you because you are black, that has nothing to do with the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. That's all done by law under the Commerce Clause. And so the idea is Congress has the authority to regulate interstate commerce. Okay? Now, after 1937, the court expanded the definition of what regulating commerce was so that the federal government had immense power to regulate all kinds of things. Prior to 1937, we could not have had a Civil Rights Act of 1964 because there would not have been any constitutional authority to hang that on. But they hung it on the Commerce Clause, and that's like, great, okay, it worked well. Problem is, since 1995, the Commerce Clause has been eroded by the court. The court keeps chipping away at it and chipping away at it. So in 1995, in a case called U.S. v. Lopez, the Supreme Court said that Congress didn't have authority to pass what was called the Gun-Free School Zone Act of 1990, and because they couldn't connect it sufficiently to commerce. A couple years later, there was a case named Morrison. Well, in the Morrison case, it was a rape case, but Congress had passed a Violence Against Women Act, and the court said, you know what? There's not sufficient constitutional authority for you to pass that kind of act, so that act is unconstitutional. That went down. Most recently, if you remember the Obamacare Act, that involved the individual mandate, and everybody was happy because, yay, the Supreme Court saved Obamacare. Well, they did it in a very, very dirty way. They only saved it because they decided that the individual mandate was a tax, and so under the taxing authority of the Constitution, it was constitutional. But they decided that a requirement that people buy insurance did not have sufficient connection to commerce to make it constitutional under the Commerce Clause. Buying insurance is not sufficiently connected to commerce to have it be constitutional under the Commerce Clause. Let that sink in a little bit. Because if the Commerce Clause goes down, all of our discrimination law in the private area goes down. And that's so far where they've been headed. Okay, then you say, well, we got the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment protects us against discrimination by states and by a doctrine called corporations. Through the 5th Amendment, it saves us against discrimination by the federal government. Okay? So isn't that sufficient? Because it says, you know, no state shall do this, all these things against a person. You can't deny them of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. You have to give them equal protection of the law. Well, what does that mean? Well, it turns out it doesn't mean the same thing for men and women. If you are talking about discrimination based on religion, based on race, based on national origin, you get what's called heightened scrutiny or strict scrutiny. So in order to discriminate, you have to show that there is a compelling state interest and it's absolutely necessary that the state take this action, this discriminatory action, to be able to make it constitutional. That's really hard. You can almost never justify, for example, discrimination based on race. If you pass a law that says black people get treated differently than white people, almost assuredly going down. But all you have to do as far as women go is intermediate scrutiny. So you just have to show that there's a reasonable, rational reason to do it and that there's a good connection. So it's a much lower standard. So states and the federal government can discriminate against women in lots of ways that they couldn't discriminate against people based on race or religion or things like that. So for those reasons, we need the E.R.A. It matters.
about Mormons for E.R.A. because I want to get to your questions.